If you're just starting out with watercolors and you've tried painting a watercolor sky, you might have found out that it's a little bit more nuanced than it might seem. But today I'm going to share with you a couple of tips and tricks and pieces of advice that I've gained over time to help you hopefully achieve a soft, beautiful watercolor sky. And if we haven't met, I'm Susan and I help aspiring artists discover the joy of watercolor, mistakes and all. This month inside of my watercolor membership, we're actually painting soft skies from blue to multicolored. Painting skies is not the easiest thing to do with watercolor because to capture the softness, you're playing with a lot of water. Water that has a mind of its own. I made a bunch of attempts while creating the lessons for my membership, so today you get to learn from my mistakes. Come along and I'll share some of the tips and techniques I found work best to achieve the look that you see here. My first and probably my biggest tip for doing soft skies like this is not to be afraid of using water. I used to be much more afraid of using a lot of water, but this is really going to be your biggest helper in achieving softness when you paint skies. It's the softness of the water and how the paint blends and bleeds when it's wet that creates that overall look and aesthetic. My next tip is to use the first wash as a sort of map. It's going to guide you as to where the clouds are. So I would take this watery mix of blue and I would start to paint the blue of the sky and I would paint around the clouds. Now, as soon as I've got that mapped out, I'm going to quickly take my brush and wash it out and grab some clean water and then come back and wet those white parts of the clouds with water. So in a sense, I'm just wetting the paper or wetting the white of the paper in order to create a very wet surface overall. Now, the reason I do this is because if you put on that watery mix of blue and you're painting around the clouds, or another way to talk about it is negative painting, so you're painting the negative space around the clouds, not the clouds themselves. If you do that and then you don't wet that white area that you're leaving as clouds, then you're going to end up with hard edges. I don't want you to trick yourself into thinking that you have to cover the sheet with a perfect gradient and then create clouds out of that. Creating a perfect gradient is not the easiest thing to do in watercolor, and we're not looking for a perfect flat blue sky or a perfect flat gradient sky. We're actually just looking for an imperfect blue sky with blobs of white in it to start with. The next is a technique that I have found works the best for me is to think of creating clouds in stages. And the technique here is to put down that first wet wash first, your map of your clouds. And then once you have that initial map, you're going to lift your big shapes first, and then you're going to lift your small shapes second. And lifting big shapes first is going to happen with tools like a big brush that can soak up a lot of water, paper towels, or even a sponge. All of these tools need to be either dry or just damp. So they're not wet, they're not dripping water. Perhaps with a sponge, for example, you would wet it and you would squeeze it out completely, and then you would use that damp sponge to begin to wipe up some of the blue to carve out some of the shapes. Paper towels would be used dry, you would press down and then lift up. And a big brush would be used similarly to a sponge. You would wet it, you would dry it off by pressing it down on a towel, and then you have a damp brush, and then you're going to swipe to lift up these bigger areas. Now, depending on how wet your paper is, don't be surprised if your lifting starts to seem futile at the beginning, because if you've used a lot of water, then you're going to lift, and then that extra water is going to encroach back onto the space that you just dried out. And if that's the case, it might be a sign to give your paper a little bit of time to absorb that water and dry before you go back and continue those big lifting moves. As the paper dries, it's a great time to begin lifting the smaller shapes because you're going to be able to lift with more precision. This is a good time to bring in smaller tools. For example, a smaller brush. I really love flat brushes and filbert brushes for lifting little edges of clouds or highlights in certain areas of clouds. You can also use a smaller area of paper towel. For example, putting your finger in a paper towel and wrapping it and then just using the very tip of your finger instead of a big scrunched up piece of towel. Now, as you begin to carve out these smaller shapes, you're going to begin to see more of those clouds come out of your painting. You're going to be able to shape them a little bit more and then get into creating the composition and the landscape of the clouds. So this is where I often spend the most time and actually have the most fun as well. But here's my last and final tip for you is to resist the urge to add detail. For a painting like this, if you're trying to achieve an aesthetic where everything is really soft and a little bit dreamy, then I would resist the urge to add too much detail. We are carving out bits of detail for the clouds. We're giving it definition, but we also don't want to go back and add things like shadowing or add things like really sharp details everywhere, because I feel like there's a subtlety to skies like this, and in order to keep this feeling, I personally add very little detail. I pick and choose where I put those harder edges or smaller details, especially when I'm lifting. There are not a lot of hard edges if you look at my painting, and that could also be, in all honesty, a sign of fear for myself. And by fear, I mean that when everything is soft like this and you begin to add hard edges and you begin to add perhaps more contrast to the softness with hard edges, it begins to feel so distinct from what's already there that it could cause you to feel the same way I feel, which is, oh no, that was too much. And I just wanted to point that out, because I don't think that me showing you this means that this is the only or the right way to do it. It just happens to be that this is how it comes out for me. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. It's not because I'm doing it right or wrong. It's just because this is the way I'm doing it at this point in my experience, and perhaps this point in where I'm going aesthetically for myself. So do what feels right for you and your aesthetic and what pleases your eye. And sometimes we can take things too far, and that's when we learn. And just remember that no matter what you end up with, whether or not you went too far or not far enough, you will learn something from this painting session, and you will be able to take it to the next one. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the tips and techniques and the quick demonstration that you saw here, this month's class inside of my membership dives deeper into creating soft skies like this with multiple colors as well. You'll also get access to all the other lessons inside of our class library, so make sure to check out the link below this video for more information. And of course, I'd love to know if you thought these tips and techniques were helpful and whether or not you were able to make progress with soft skies like this. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.